Great, there we go. So, hi comrades, I'm Dante. I'm a member of Pagliacci Rossi, which is the study and research group which has helped organise tonight's discussion. We're a group based in London with a residency at the Mayday Rooms archive, and we also have members active in Belfast and Trento. As the title of today's event makes clear, class and/or architecture, we're interested in discussing the tensions around architecture, class, the workers' movement, revolutionary forms, and the prospects of autonomy of social life and reproduction under capitalism. As with all the events we've organised and run before, our research group is primarily interested in the history and the afterlives of the workerist moment, not purely for antiquarian reasons, but because we think they could critically and crucially inform the shape of today's struggles, the shape of today's struggles, and help us reflect on the directions that they might take. So the plans for tonight's discussion is to hear from our two speakers on their recent book projects and their broader reflections on the topic. And then we're going to move on to a more open Q&A and discussion with everyone else who is here. So first we'll be hearing from Jacopo Galimberti, author of the recent Images of Class, Operaismo, Autonomia and the Visual Arts 1962 to 1988. And then we'll pass over to Nick Thoburn, who's the author of the very recent Brutalism Has Found Housing, Form and Crisis at Robin Hood Gardens, which has just been published 2 months ago as part of the Spatial Politics series with Goldsmiths Press. Perfect. So I'll pass over to Jacopo now.
Thank you, Dante, for the invitation. And I have a PowerPoint, if that's okay. And then basically, I wanted to discuss some categories. I'm not a historian of architecture, but in my book, I try to kind of delineate some categories that should allow us to connect the past with the present. And I think this is especially useful today because Nick and I have been looking at different contexts, UK, Italy, different time frames. So I think some categories could help us to kind of move beyond the specificities of our context and establish a dialogue. So that was the purpose of my PowerPoint. So now I should be able to share it. Let's see whether it works. Screen. Wait a minute, Dante. Yes, it should be like that, right? Yeah. Let's see. Let me see if can you see it? Okay, brilliant. So I just wanted to give you a bit of context before I introduce these categories. So in my book, I look at Italy in the 60s and 70s. So in order to understand the kind of political debates around architecture, we need to say a few words about the situation beforehand in the immediate post-war years. So Italy, very much like other Western European countries, experienced a phase that was called economic boom. So a phase of high GDP and partly fueled by the Marshall Plan and the 1963 phase is mostly characterized by a GDP that was about 5 to 6, 7%, and even more in the most industrial areas. But this economic swell was also accompanied by a large wave of migration from the south of the country to the north, and especially, of course, to the main manufacturing centers, notably Turin and Milan, but also Rome to a certain extent. So, of course, it generated a problem of housing shortage. Ina Casa or Ina Case was a government public housing program that had created a huge amount of homes that had to kind of house these people, but also and we'll see, also had other goals. And the third point I want to discuss before I introduce my 3 categories is the shift from architecture to urban planning. The poster you can see on your right-hand side is a very nice film that deals with speculation in the realm of housing in the early 60s. You might have seen it. So Ina Casa, so what was Ina Casa? It was a very demagogic brainchild of the Christian Democrats. So basically the idea was to build new houses, fine, but how and where and why? Well, where? Most often in relatively isolated places at the very edge of large cities. So as you can see in the image below, basically in the countryside. Of course, these places look different. They are mostly integrated in the metropolitan sprawling of the main cities, but it was the countryside. So isolated places. Also, it was, of course, the goal was also to give a boost to the construction sector, but, and this is extremely important, the Ina Casa program deliberately used labor-intensive construction methods because one of the main goals was to employ people, to provide jobs. Also because, of course, they feared that unemployment could generate communism. The Communist Party was a massive, very popular mass party that had about 25% of the votes at the elections. So the Americans and the Italian elites, of course, feared that the Communist Party could win a general election. So try to get to the power via democratic means. So the Ina Casa was basically the kind of background of operaismus and its reflections over housing. Okay, so a very demagogic, Catholic-minded program. In fact, I just wanted to give you an anecdote, which is extremely interesting to kind of understand also the distance from this atmosphere, this kind of worldview. Initially, the party wanted to kind of allocate houses randomly. Why? Well, because they wanted to instill the value of providence. So they didn't want to kind of consider how many children you have, your income, but randomly. So just to give you a sense of how Catholic and also extremist in a way, some members of the party were. So some housing complexes are quite interesting and famous, like Tiburtino here in Rome, which uses vernacular architecture, as you can tell. So the idea is to kind of provide a sense of, yes, rural vernacular constructions. But also one of the key ideas was to kind of follow the environment, to kind of mirror the environment. Why? Well, I copy-pasted some of the guidelines that architects were given, okay? And I wanted to read it with you. It's extremely interesting to understand some of the proposals that made architects adhere to operate. So the conditions of the land, the exposure to the sun, the landscape, the vegetation, the existing environment should suggest the form of the housing complex so that the inhabitants will have the impression of something spontaneous, genuine, and indissolubly tied to the place where they stand. So basically what you have here is a massive housing program of social housing that is set against modernism, which is seen in post-war Italy as 1920s modernism, for example, as something not humane, something anonymous. So, and this is a kind of, okay, well, I provide some more kind of mundane examples of Ina Casa, which are sometimes quite, bland. I lived in one of those for a year. And so just to give you kind of a, this is not necessarily interesting like Quartieri Fortequezzi, very bland housing. Some members I will show you that in a minute, but some activists of Classe Operaia had the Ina Casa program in mind. That was a kind of enemy, if you like. The second, well, actually, the third point I want to kind of discuss before I introduce the points, categories I want discuss with you is the shift from architecture to urban planning. So basically, let's put it simply. Some commentators, some critics, some architects realized that if a shift in scale was required to be effective, politically effective. So architecture was often seen as something that could not have a social political effect on the social fabric. So the shift in scale implied also, well, of course, a shift from architecture to urban planning, but also the need for new categories, like territory city, which is one of these categories that try to kind of capture the need to rethink or to reframe architectural debates, right? So not the city, not the individual building, of course, something in between, something that also embraces the territory, the kind of sprawling growth of the urban centers in Italy. So new concepts, new levels of analysis, and also new professions, because you need to remember that there was no such thing like urban planners in early 60s in Italy. So architects basically became urban planners without being trained as urban planners. There was a shift. So this shift was mostly reflected a political desire to be effective, to kind of shape the economic boom from an urban perspective. Okay, let's have a look at the three positions. I wanted to kind of delineate and in order to establish a dialogue with Nick's work. So I call them positions because actually they were embraced or rejected by the same people. So no one really identified with one position, because of course reality is much more complicated than theory. So sometimes some members of Classe Operaia, the first magazine, if you like, of operaismo, were architects, and sometimes they adhered to what I'll describe as class architecture, but sometimes they also embrace the class critique of architecture. So I call them positions because they do not correspond to, so they're kind of, let's say, ideal type in a sociological discourse. So very, very schematic positions. They help us kind of capture reality, but they're not a faithful depiction of reality. So basically, probably I should have clarified that from the start. When I began carrying out research on operaismo and autonomy, I realized that, of course, some militants were artists, some of them were designers, but quite a large number, relatively large number, were actually architects. So I had to kind of, I realized I had to kind of explore that discussion, and the reason why, so many architects were part of this group. So I came to realize that around, let's say in the 60s, in the milieu of operaismo, so let's say in the milieu of Classe Operaia, the first magazine, but also of Contropiano, which is another magazine closely related to operaismo, at least in the beginning. Activists, militants, intellectuals develop basically three categories. Well, the first one is what we can call class architecture. So the belief that although architecture in and of itself cannot solve social problems, it can nonetheless foster working class autonomy, even in a capitalist society. Okay, this is class architecture. A class critique of architecture that was mostly articulated by Tafuri was basically a critique of this belief. So the idea that this position tends to discard, so class critique of architecture tends to think that class architecture is a palliative or was a self-deception, in the absence of a grip on the reins of political economic power. So class critique of architecture should clarify the agency of architects and planners, should not basically, how can we say, generate the belief that the architects or urban planners can actually change much. It's a quite difficult position for architects, because of course you can hardly build anything if you stick to this position. So this is why I told you some architects actually virtually agreed with this position, but in fact when they had the opportunity to build something, they ended up implementing a sort of class architecture. I will show you some example in a minute. And this is a third position, which we can call militant architect planner or territorialist, that tries to combine the two, basically saying, yeah, fair enough, a class architecture is something very problematic. A class critique of architecture is, from a Marxist perspective, possibly more meaningful, more interesting, more accurate, but we can do stuff. We can actually, be active in the social fabric. And for example, I mentioned some actions. So occupy, play, houses. We can implement illegal actions against rent. So it's an attempt basically to move away from a rather intellectual position, or rather academic position that was, let's say, that of a class critique of architecture, typical of Tafuri. I will give you some examples of this position. So class architecture in Italy within the operaismo and autonomia was often influenced by some very prominent models like Red Vienna, and you have the Karl Marx Hof, but also from the Russian constructivists, the Narkomfin. Here you have an example of how a member of Prothero Pariah tried to blend the two. I don't know whether you can read it. So basically, he was charged with designing a working class town in not far from Florence. He was only 25, 26. And so he ended up merging the super block of Red Vienna and the kind of visual idioms and collective structures of the Narkomfin. But also the urban plan was also a very political, embodied a very political method, because it acted almost as a city wall that stopped the buildable the city, and basically made room for the countryside. So that the space on your right hand side was meant to be for horticulture. So this is just an example to show how this plan was actually implemented. So more or less, although I mean the story is way more complicated than that. But so how you can practice a form of class architecture. This is another example. This is a laureate thesis, a sort of a diploma for architects in Italy, 5 years, a laureate of 5 years diploma was actually. So the idea is to design a factory that shapes the territory. If you have a look at the image on the right-hand side, you have the city of Prato on top, but only the city center. Prato is a pretty large city, actually. So you can think of how big the factory should have been. This is a mega structure. This is let's say, dystopian project, but also to a certain extent, it was also utopia. Why? Well, because Greppi who was an active member, in fact, also to a certain extent, a leader of class operaia and then of pater operaia, thought, well, that, you know, in a very Marxist way, well, the more the better. The more workers work together in this massive space, the more politicized they will become. So the project, it kind of suggests the need to speed up Taylorism, but also to kind of provide a non-ideological architecture or urban plan. So what does it mean non-ideological? Well, it means that you have to kind of reveal the ideological side of the Una Casa housing program. So that kind of rootedness that I was pointing out, the idea that inhabitants have to feel a sort of perceive a sense of belongingness. Yeah, the country, sorry, the hill, for example, near Genoa should shape, you know, the housing complex. Is contradicted by this word, because basically the idea is that you should not try to integrate the working class. You should not provide images of, you know, reassuring images of integration of how can I say, of rootedness. Greppi exposes anonymity and the endless repetition of the same, which is, of course, also an allegory of capitalism. I could go on, but I mean, the actual project is quite subtle and also, how can I say? Yeah, it also describes the place of trade unions and so on, but it would take me too far. Another project that was devised within the same milieu, that of Classe Operaia, the first magazine of operaismo. Paola Jervis, a woman, she did pretty much the same. As you can see, the landscape, the very, you know, famous landscape and countryside of Tuscany is not integrated into the project. The project basically depicts a massive settlement where you have the houses here, the small blocks, and the factories, and even the countryside on the left-hand side. On your left, the left image, will be you know, subject or kind of shaped by Taylorism. As you can see, you only have fields and, you know, and canals and so on. So it's a way to kind of increase and speed up Taylorism. But also, as I said, it's a non-ideological architecture, anonymous, unsparing, revealing class conflict rather than a kind of harmonious merge of countryside and human settlement. Another example of class architecture is a feminist or materialist feminist architecture that was discussed at a workshop organized by the group Immagine, a feminist art group that was part of the Wages for Housework campaign. And in this workshop, they actually thought, well, maybe we can see it as a different strategy. So it's not about revealing the class contradiction of the territory, but rather showing the work of women in the house. So the idea was to have to shape an apartment in a way that women will transition from their room to, let's say, the kitchen, in order to show the work, to show that someone is going to work, right? So this is another visual strategy, or to kind of produce a sort of class architecture. This is, of course, is also feminist architecture. The second category I mentioned was a class critique of architecture. And the main figure was, of course, this rather satanic man. I deliberately chose this nice picture. Well, of course, Tafuri, I hope you know some of his works. I cannot summarize the complexity of his thought. But one sentence has to be mentioned, however, I think, because this is a very famous and also rather clear statement. Just as there can be no such thing as a political economy of class, but only a class critique of political economy. Likewise, there can never be an aesthetics, art, or architecture of class, but only a class critique of aesthetics, art, architecture, and the city. So I think this is a sort of manifesto of what some activists define as a class critique of architecture. So this was mostly developed, at least in the beginning, within Contropiano. It was initially launched within Operaismo. It was launched by activists coming from Class Operaia, who slowly moved away from Operaismo, but only later, I would say. But okay, so a class critique of architecture is, of course, a theoretical position, but something that can also be visualized, of course. And some architects try to do that. So, for example, a group of students, some of them will then form ArchitZoom, devised what they called a Brechtian architecture. It was a project, it was for an exam, many drawings, some models, to depict what we call today an edge city. So what was Brechtian about that? Well, basically they use many different modes of expressions. There was comics, as you can see, also some rather allegorical drawings, texts, and so on, to kind of describe a city in a rather epic way. So the idea was to kind of put capitalism, its absurd logic, at a distance, and to show it. So I guess that's the Brechtian side of it. So the kind of estrangement effect produced by distance, by a kind of objective, cold gaze that prevents empathy, or in this case, a sort of possibly techno-utopia that was very typical of early 60s. Another project that we can associate with this position, the class critique of architecture, is that of No Stop City, which was one of the main projects made by ArchitZoom. They called it an image-based discourse, but what is it? It's basically an attempt to visualize a sort of critique of the ideology of architecture. So No Stop City aimed to reveal the mystification of a kind of, well, inacase, of course, but also of a rather progressive reformist attitude that was typical of the institutional left, also in relation to urban planning and architecture. So the idea was to depict how the capitalist metropolis would have looked if it had been stripped of its pre-industrial imagery. So what would have been the ultimate embodiment of a capitalist architecture? Well, not the inacase, not a humanist or Catholic housing complex, or urban plan that kind of mirrors nature. Quite the opposite. Well, they said the supermarket. So the 0 degree of architecture is truly non-ideological capitalist architecture. Something that doesn't try to kind of veil the contradictions of the system. Something, that is in your face, we can say, I guess. And this is also the interior of space of the non-stop city. The third position is that of the militant architect, which is visually probably less interesting, but there are some attempts to kind of depict what the militant architect should do or could do. Sometimes they're quite ironic. This is some of these were displayed at MoMA, and they are, as you can tell, photoromanzi, photoromances. They describe the struggles within the frame of the social fabric, but also in particular with regard to housing, housing occupations, and what else? Rent strikes and so on. Sometimes it's in Italian, but there's an interest in your book about some of these actions and other publications that were made within Potere Operaio's, the chief after 68, 69 Operaismo, well, generated a few groups, and one of them was Potere Operaio. So this is it. These are the three categories I want us to kind of delineate to establish a dialogue with what Nick is gonna talk about. Thank you. Now I have to stop the share. Wait a minute. Okay.
Great. Go ahead, Nick. Thank you, Jacopo.
So yeah, many thanks, Dante and Pagliacci Rossi, for the invitation. I'm hoping our two papers they're very different in their relationship to a class movement, if we put it like that. And I think that's an interesting difference that hopefully will become apparent as I talk, and then we can draw out in discussion. And Tafuri is at the fulcrum of both of them in a way, which is rather nice. So I'm going to take the title of tonight's event, Class and or Architecture. It's a chance to present the concept of class architecture as it manifests in brutalism and in the Robin Hood Gardens council estate. It's a concept and a focus that I develop in my new book, Brutalism as Found. And I'm going to share my screen. Can you see that? So I'm going to depart from conventional understandings of brutalist architecture, which focus on its material qualities, famously its raw, unadorned, monumental concrete, to instead approach brutalism as a question of form, or deforming form. And I'm going to suggest that Robin Hood Gardens, designed by Alison and Peter Smithson and inhabited for 50 years by a multiracial working class, is an arrangement, or an awkward arrangement, of different built forms. These forms are at once material, spatial, social, sensory, and temporal, and they are wrought from critical engagement with the fraught conditions of class society. And I'd stress at the outset that class, as I'm going to talk about it, as it's articulated in built form, class architecture, is not a retro quality of this estate, but what makes it most experimental and most of our time. I should say too that the brutalism with which I'm concerned is specifically that of Alison and Peter Smith, and I'll be drawing mostly on their writings with a little bit of Tafuri and Jameson, and perhaps Lord Deleuze and Marx. So to give you some context, my talk is based on a 3-year collaborative project with a photographer, Koyas Mir, and researchers Runa Kalik and Iklima Begum. It's a project that centered residents' lived experiences of the estate through interviews and portrait photography of some 30, well, interviews with 38 residents and portraits of some 30 families and individuals. Now, I understand this lived experience to be integral to the estate's class architecture. And I hope to convey a little bit of that by showing some of Coyce's portraits and some reflections from residents towards the end of the talk. Although my contribution this evening is primarily theoretical, focused, as I say, on the problem of class architecture. So our project began in dismay that the estate's residents were completely marginalized from the public discourse about its merits, failings, and future. Moreover, those in government and the press who fought for its demolition had a mendacious habit of justifying their hostility to the estate on what they claimed to be the views of residents. They were always speaking in the mouths of residents. What we found, on the contrary, was, and I don't think this will surprise you so much, was that Robin Hood Gardens was much appreciated by its residents, despite this common view that it was despised. They valued its council housing. They've held strong attachments to its social and architectural qualities, and this despite it's suffering decades of stigmatization and local neglect. So to introduce the estate, it was comprised of 214 apartments in 2 mid-rise concrete slab blocks, sheltering between them a large green and artificial mound. Here's one of the 2 blocks demolished in 2018, along with its mortal foe behind. And as is still the case in the other block yet to be demolished, the estate is characterized by its open air access decks or streets in the sky, and the protruding rhythmic mullions or fins that vertically stride the exposed concrete facades. Completed in 1972, it was the only built mass housing scheme by Alison and Peter Smithson. And perhaps this is something we'll discuss, later. This, of course, is a built scheme, which is a difference from some of the projects Jacopo was talking about. Completed in 72, so designed by Alison and Peter Smithson, the founding exponents of brutalism. Here they are with Peter on the left, with fellow brutalists, the sculptor Edoardo Palozzi and the photographer Nigel Henderson. These are the kind of 4 founding figures, and it's significant they all work in different domains, I suppose, of kind of art, loosely of art practice. Today, the estate is poised midway through a 2-phase demolition as part of a private regeneration on a line called Blackwall Ridge. Okay, to tease out the class architecture of Robin Hood Gardens, I'll start with the features of brutalism as the Smithsons formulated it, and then present some class problems with the way brutalism is consumed today. The Smithsons coined the term in 1953 to describe aesthetic features of the legibility and display of structure and materials in their unrealized house in Soho. From this and later remarks, we now have the well-known feature of brutalism for its raw materiality. Architectural materials were not to be covered over or modeled through geometric form as per white cube modernism. They were instead to be used unadorned or as found, valued for their expressive qualities, morphological capacities, and contingent effects. Hence the source of the name brutalism in Le Corbusier's post-war style of brut or raw concrete. Now, this attention to materiality clearly is crucial to brutalism, but it gives us only half of the picture, a half that in representing the whole actually turns brutalism against itself. And what I want to stress throughout this talk instead, also, are the social dimensions of brutalism. prompted to do so by the crystalline definition from the Smithsons in 1957. Brutalism, they write, tries to fake to a mass production society and drag a rough poetry out of the confused and powerful forces which are at work. Up to now, brutalism has been discussed stylistically, whereas its essence is ethical. Now, if we work with this passage a little, the social here is not a domain separate from the aesthetic and the architectural. Rather, brutalist rough poetry was to be achieved only insofar as the style itself was a direct engagement with social forces, a direct engagement with mass production society. This society was not understood to be an integrated whole, a cozy welfare state, but was understood as fraught, fractured, and incomplete. And within it, architecture was to be critically immersed. In Peter Smithson's words, brutalism cleaves to the realities of the situation, with all their contradictions and confusions, trying to do something with them. Now, the Smithsons weren't Marxists, and what little they say directly about politics tends to a really rather anodyne social democracy. But their understanding of the social dynamics of brutalism here shares with Manfredo Tafuri, who Jacopo was talking about a moment ago, a critique of architectural transcendence. And before I say more about that in brutalism, I want to bring in Tafuri a little, because he has a formulation that lies at the heart of the concept of class architecture, even as he refuses its possibility. Now, any theory of working class architecture is confronted by a pretty significant problem, namely that architecture is the most capitalist of all the arts. So deeply enmeshed is it with the social relations of land, construction, and finance. And it's a problem memorably identified by Frederick Jameson, who writes, of all the arts, architecture is the closest constitutively to the economic, with which in the form of commissions and land values, it has a virtually unmediated relationship. Now, this condition leads Tafuri to the intransigent principle that class architecture is a contradiction in terms, that there can be no built articulation of the working class standpoint, that outside of a revolution, class can bring to architecture only critique, as Jacopo explained. And then to give that quotation again, he writes first in Contrapiano and then in Architecture and Utopia, just as there cannot exist a class political economy, but only a class criticism of political economy, and of course he's referring to Marx here, so too there cannot be founded a class aesthetic, art, or architecture, but only a class criticism of the aesthetic of art, of architecture, of the city itself. When architecture does create a positive working class example, what he calls utopian architecture, it is actually mystifying of class society, where islands of realized utopia, as he disparages it, leave the underlying social life unchanged. Now, you might expect Jameson to agree, given they both share this sense of the immanence of capital to architecture, but he doesn't. As well as seeing architecture as the most capitalist of art, he also sees architecture as a profound and extremely important site of post-capitalist, or for him, utopian potential, given how central architecture will have to be in reconfiguring social life and the human sensorium in post-capitalist ways, given how central architecture is to social life today, and given architecture's capacity on paper and occasionally in built form to project and evoke post-capitalist modes of being in sensory, social, and imaginative ways. So in relationship to the projects that Jacopo is engaging with. For Jameson, architecture is not utopian, and for him that's, you know, a good thing. Utopia is a good thing as compared to Tafuri. Architecture is not utopian because it helps fashion a revolutionary subject. Architecture is utopian because it helps reconfigure the human sensorium and project something beyond capital. So there's a difference here in terms of there's no agent, there's no revolutionary agent to how Jameson understands the utopian in architecture. I think it's worth pointing that out, and hopefully we'll come back to that problem later on. Well, I don't think it is necessarily a problem, it's a different approach. But what Jameson loses, and it's interesting to say this after I say there's no revolutionary agent, is that he also loses any real understanding of how this utopian architecture can handle class. Class seems to sort of vanish from his understanding of architectural utopias. And so I find Tafuri's formulation, rather than Jameson's, more useful, even if you know, it has to be twisted and worked with and so forth. So to twist Tafuri a little, I like to take his stringent disavowal of architectural autonomy in the quotation we saw a minute ago to be less a refusal of the built existence of class architecture than a wrenching and propulsive insistence that class architecture can achieve no self-coherent identity. And I'll explain that through brutalism in two ways. By insisting on brutalism's refusal of autonomy or transcendence from class society, and through the form of class that inheres in my understanding of class architecture. So first of all, the source of brutalism's critical dynamism is its lack of transcendence. Oops. In Ben Heimel's words, where the permanent uncertainty of any resolution propels brutalism back into the social world as a form of ethical realism. Brutalist rough poetry was not then meant to redeem society, but rather to create something of value in confrontation with it, in Alex Kitnick's phrase. To this end, it had a strident quality, a brute injunction to social relevance. So brutalism is not brutal, but it is brute, it's direct. And this is an important dimension of the meaning that's often lost when people refer to brutalist articulation of raw concrete. In Peter Smithson's words, we are interested in expressing not ourselves, but what is going on, what's going on in the social world. And building which denies what is going on is just the opposite of brutalism. It's shishi, a sort of evasion. Smithson here sheds an unfavorable light on a dominant trend in today's brutalist revival, a trend where the monumentality and the so-called beauty of brutalism are championed in separation from its social relations. By Peter Smithson's standard, this is the opposite of brutalism, a shishi evasion of social realities. And now we can start adding in the question of class, which I'll kind of slowly unpack through the rest of the talk. So this brutalist revival, beautiful brutalism, I'll call it, may sound harmless enough, even necessary, given the stigmatization so long directed towards brutalist architecture. It's difficult not to welcome it, but whether by intent or default, beautiful brutalism all too easily becomes an active party in urban regeneration, where working class residents are socially cleansed from housing estates, once decried as concrete monstrosities, but now refashioned for middle-class habitation as modernist masterpieces. Why is this? Well, this brutalist revival, beautiful brutalism, is indexed, I think, to the resale of right to buy council purchases and the ballooning property prices that have put traditional middle-class housing stock increasingly out of reach. Fearful of council estates and anxious about downward social mobility, the brutalist revival eases the transition into the new market, where it serves to translate, legitimize, and codify working class housing for middle class consumption, a point made forcefully by Bev Skeggs regarding other middle class appropriations of working class cultural forms. Indeed, in some cases, beautiful brutalism actively drives the transition, most prominently in Sheffield's Park Hill on the left and East London's Balfron Tower on the right. Council estates that were virulently denigrated and stigmatized as concrete monstrosities when they housed the working class, but are now privatized and heavily marketed on the basis of their brutalist aesthetic. And incidentally, although this really is another talk, this recoding of brutalism for middle class consumption is the context and the effect of the V&A's recent salvaging and museum display of a chunk of Robin Hood Gardens, which some of you might have heard of. So I'm suggesting not only that the exclusively aesthetic reading of brutalism is a misunderstanding of this architecture, but also that in excising the social from the aesthetic, it serves the social in the mode of social cleansing, in the mode of class cleansing, in the mode of regeneration. That's its function, or certainly its effect. There's a second pole of the brutalist revival today where class and the social do feature. We can call it social democratic brutalism, another pole. But here, class is misconceived and even more outdated as such, where the working class is seen to be, or to have been, a relatively coherent social identity. Now, in this view, this social democratic brutalism, the post-war welfare state provided affordable mass housing to a class that was well integrated in Keynesian social and economic planning, a class that had a place in society. Well, this was in part true of Robin Hood Gardens, but what's so extraordinary about the estate is that it expresses the working class condition not as coherent identity, but as crisis and non-identity. And through this prism, class as crisis, we can see the estate not as a retro throwback to a glorious welfare state, but as absolutely of our present, even as it is demolished. And this is a central thesis of my book, so I'm going to unpack it a little bit, this understanding of class. I'm suggesting, and here I draw especially on Marx and Deleuze, that the working class is a non-identity, a fraught and unstable social condition, buffeted and pulled out of shape by the social relations that course through it. It's a crisis condition that was felt in the welfare state period too. Just think of how gender, racialization, and colonialism fashioned a much more fraught and out of joint class experience than we usually imagine of that period. But today, class as crisis has become generalized due to deindustrialization, precarity, welfare retrenchment, housing privatization, stagnating wages, ballooning personal debt, forced migration, and so on and so forth. It's a condition then encapsulated by the French group theory communiste. The working class, or the proletariat, is in itself nothing, a non-identity, but a nothing full of social relations. Well, this is a bleak social condition, but it's also a radical one. For without a place of its own, no achieved and satisfied identity accommodated to society, politics adequately this condition is necessarily restless and wrenching, a restless and wrenching engagement with society as a whole, not an inward-looking project, not an expression of its identitarian self, but an outward-looking engagement with the myriad of social relations that cleave and buffet each particular class. So with that understanding of the non-identity and crisis-ridden nature of class, we can get back to Robin Hood Gardens and follow Peter Smithson's injunction to engage with what is going on today. And it's in the estate's relation to this understanding of class, this experience of class today, class as crisis and non-identity, that I think we can understand its class architecture. And we can do so in two ways. There are two facets of class architecture, as I understand it. First, the class condition of Robin Hood Gardens is, to an overwhelming degree, the assault of class society on working class housing. If we focus on the UK and London, the assault from right to buy sales of council housing to the current estate demolition programme, which is key to the renewed calibration of the city to profit, rent and speculation at appalling social cost. In addition to the thousands of council homes demolished to date, a recent estimate is 31,000 Londoners facing the loss of their homes due to estate regeneration. And the group Estate Watch has identified some 100 London estates currently threatened with whole or partial demolition. Class architecture in the manner of Tafuri demands that we critically attend to and fight this, including to its cultural aspects, as I've been doing with regard to beautiful brutalism. My focus for the rest of the talk, though, is on not that critical side, but on the second aspect of the estate's class architecture, namely how it confronts, bears and modulates the working class condition in its architectural forms. I mentioned that at the start of my talk, but now I'll schematize what I mean by architectural form before briefly some examples. So I've come to think of Robin Hood Gardens as a single and integrated architectural whole, but as an arrangement of different forms or deforming forms to emphasize their combination of continuity and change. Each form emerges from sensing, teasing out, grappling with, and materially fashioning a particular problem in working class experience, where this experience is at once social, spatial, physical, sensory, and temporal. Problems then provoke form. It's from encounters with problems in the social and material world, not from the minds of architects, where arises class architecture. In confronting and modulating social problems into form, the forms of class architecture, just as the non-identity of class, are necessarily incomplete, fraught, and open. And at Robin Hood Gardens, these forms are both interlaced and they pull in different directions, loosened from determination by a unitary whole, each with different effects on the whole and each with their own instabilities and lack of closure. You know, one might say each with their own non-identity. And each form is processual, where the form is in deformation, in movement, in process, form that is enlivened by the social and environmental forces, relations and practices with which it grapples and which are extended through use, through inhabitation. So if we turn to Robin Hood Gardens, the Smithsons provide a means to name these forms. If we use terms that they coined in their efforts here and elsewhere to wrest architectural form out of social problems. And in my book, I suggest that the estate comprises four main forms, to each of which I devote a chapter to. But I can set them out briefly here, and this will be my last point, setting out these forms. So on the left of this text here is the object or the problem that the architecture engages, the social problem. And then on the right, the Smithsons concepts that convey the grappling of that problem into architectural form. So starting at the top, we have the problem of the street fashioned into streets in the sky. And you saw briefly an image of one of those at the beginning. Elevated up in the expanse of open air, a social and playful response to the crisis of the working class street, the street degraded by the pollution and the spatial dominance of the car. It's also a move against the loss of the street that was coming with high-rise building at the time. And these streets really were an extraordinary experience, walking out of the apartments, onto the decks, laying claim to the views across London, momentarily losing oneself in the expanse of open space. It's a quality wonderfully described by one of the estate's caretakers when we asked Wayne Allison of his thoughts about the estate's brutalist style, the unpainted concrete, its chunky, hulking look. He said this: people would say, yes, it's all concrete, but no, it's not. It's completely open. You can walk on the street decks from one side of the building to the other side, and it's just air coming in. You can breathe. When we asked Letitia and William Fakamus, whether they wouldn't prefer a private balcony rather than these public street decks, a couple responded that balconies in the new developments might look attractive, but they consolidate an insular approach to life, the correlate of a housing industry that, as they put it, cares more about money than the meaning of life. Here, we all know each other, but if you go into a private balcony, you will know nothing or nobody. For Letitia, walking home along the street decks would sometimes remind her of the catwalks of her youth as a fashion model, while a Christian, she imagined the wonder of God's global embrace in their expansive visual connectivity to pedestrians, cars, airplanes, and riverboats. And Mofia Rahman located the value of the street decks in an open-air sociality, here illustrating also a post-colonial dimension of East London during this period. He said, we always talked about the walkways or the street decks being like Bangladesh. People did unbelievable things on them, like riding bikes. I don't mean one bike, but 4 bikes going past each other. They played carom board, it was so wide. In Eid, the doors would be open in every house, and you would have all these people, swathes of people going up and down the corridors in their glitzy outfits. It gave them the opportunity to live an outdoor life. Now, I'll be much more brief about the other 3 forms of the estate. So the second is the problem of home, fashioned in the mode of ordinariness and light, as the Smithsons called it. So against the domestic isolation of the bourgeois home in its contented separation from the world outside, as is how the bourgeoisie experiences society, you know, at once facilitator and mere background of their distinct individualities. Here, the working class, who remember is coursing with social relations, here the working class home offers a pocket of protection from and is in connection with the social, natural and cosmic world outside the home. And this occurs architecturally on the estate through a series of built thresholds. The estate is, if you like, a collection of thresholds between home and the outside. Thresholds where home is tentatively and experimentally opened to the unhomely. The estate's third form concerns its concrete. Now, I couldn't talk about brutalism without saying something about concrete. We find at Robin Hood Gardens, though, that its concrete is not the poured timber textured concrete that's so admired by fans of brutalism, but rather it's a concrete that provides an aesthetic of the surface, a surface that modulates the industrial process of repetition. The rhythmic placement of the surface mullions and their light and sound reflecting protrusion creates a surface of repetition and difference, an aesthetic unique to mass phenomena against the individuality of the bourgeois subject and the aesthetic of standardization that is normally imputed to the working class. And finally, the estate engaged the problem or lack of working class landscape, the removal of the urban proletariat from nature. And it fashioned this into what the Smithsons called the charged void. Here, a proletarian urban nature was carved out of the industrial site, where the two buildings were pushed to the edge of the site to provide a zone of protection and charged space between them, the space in between, the charged void. And along with this sort of industrial nature, they plonked down an anomalous, really rather strange mound, comprised of all the rubble, or constituted of all the rubble of the build and previous tenements that had existed beforehand. So the space between the charged void, the mound, create this this kind of magic of the unforeseen, a really quite sort of unusual, strange, and exciting urban nature, right plonked down at the edge of the docks of East London. And that's where I'll stop. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you very much, both of you. Wonderful presentations. So I think now maybe we've got 2 questions in the chat, and then if people are interested they can type their comments and their questions into the chat, or we can pass over the microphone to people who have questions, and we can have some discussion. So Philip Mesco has got a raised hand, but I'll quickly read out James Dunbar's question as well. I think this was for Jacopo, and James asks, wondering if you could elaborate later on the institutional critique of architecture, maybe from Tronti's influence through the radical groups of the late 60s, e.g. Superstudio, Archizoom, and UFO. And also wants to ask about the fact that these critiques of capitalism were often presented with irony and satire, but were also often misread as actual proposals. So could you comment perhaps on the reception of these movements like No Stop City or the Continuous Monument?
Yeah, thank you for the question, James. I think we tend to see Superstudio, UFO, and Archizoom as part of the same movement, which is partly true, but there were also major political differences. In fact, whereas Superstudio whereas Archizoom and UFO were very close to Potere Operaio, Archizoom is slightly earlier, so in fact they were close to Tronti and Classe Operaia. Superstudio is virtually a right-wing group. In fact, there's a big difference between the techno-utopia, technophilia of Superstudio and the class critique of architecture typified by Archizoom. So I think, I mean, the reception of these groups has been very much affected by how the members talked about the previous work, which is sometimes quite problematic. Well, in the first place, because, for example, Archizoom was made of 6 people. And so everyone had a different opinion, a different reading of the group's undertaking. So it's very difficult to kind of read these interviews and make sense of what the group was all about, because of course, you don't have a synthesis anymore because its members are now, independent architects or designers. I think so. I think the reception is quite diverse, but we still need to actually go back to the, let's say, primary literature and read the text. So, for example, and I'll start with that. No Stop City. If you read a text that accompany, in fact, are part of No Stop City, it's very clear that what Stop City is meant to be. It's a critical discourse through images. It's a sort of visualization of, let's say, contropianos and to a certain extent, Tafuri's theory. A very interesting take on that, very visual, but it's not meant to be, you know, a real project or a kind of futuristic project. Yeah.
If there are any other questions or points anyone would like to make to the floor, if not, I have a quick one to Nick as well. Maybe I can ask you a quick one, Nick, while other people think of some questions or points. So obviously Jacopo has mentioned how the architects and the theorists within Archizoom drew, you know, they're active participants within the kind of workerist groups and movements. And as you mentioned, the architects for Robin Hood's estates weren't, you know, they weren't Marxist, but they were sensitive to the questions of the social reality of capitalism and how architecture and the buildings they're making were within it. And in the sense that I'm sure the Archizoom architects were drawing on the tradition of inquiry, or at least reflecting on how they understood working class life and struggled to be. What kind of resources were the architects of Robin Hood estates building their conceptions of brutalism and the social and how that would embody the social contradiction and tensions of their buildings? What kind of theoretical insights were they drawing on, or the tradition were they drawing on? Just if you could clarify that perhaps as a comparison with the kind of resources which Archizoom and other workerist architects were drawing on.
I think when you listen to Nick, when I listen to Nick at least, you realize that the architects of operaismo or of classe operaia were still had a very kind of or rather traditional image of the working class, you know, collective life, shared spaces, the critique of individualism. And I think Nick's approach is extremely interesting, but because that reveals the limits implicit in the projects these architects devised, I think, but also in Tafuri's argument, because Tafuri's in a way seems to kind of imply what, you know, what the class ethos, you know, should look like. It doesn't define, I mean, and I think, in fact, but if you read Tronti carefully, and if you read Marx carefully, the description of a working class ethos is much more complicated than that. It's not at all stereotypical, even in Tronti. And Nick and I discussed that quite a few times. In fact, Deleuze at some point quotes Tronti, well, Nick will tell you better than me, but at some point, Tronti also has this kind of the class as, you know, what we know of the working class, but also as a sort of is a kind of, yeah, I don't know how Nick framed it, as a subject against itself, as a disidentification. And this dichotomy is also present in Tronti, but it's not present, in my view, in Tafuri, for example.
I'd like to get back to you on that last point, Jacopo, but because that's an interesting observation. But Dante, in terms of your question, I think there's a lot to say, so I want to make sure I don't say too much. What the strange thing is, and that's why it's interesting with the two of us giving these talks at the same event, is that, as I indicated in my talk, the Smithsons are not Marxist. They have no link whatsoever to any of the kinds of traditions that we know well. There's one note that I've noticed where they suggest that someone sent them the Situationist International journal, but they don't, and they seem to have been influenced by Guy Debord and Ascayon's psychogeographic map of Paris, if anybody knows that, where the map was cut up and then reconfigured to express the psychogeographic qualities of the different regions of Paris. And I think they used that in a project they designed for Berlin on the old train tracks in Berlin called Wild I can't remember what it's called, not Wild City or Wildlife, but Wild something or other. So that's it, as far as I can tell, in terms of a relationship to anything like a revolutionary tradition. They didn't read Marxism. They weren't interested in French theory. You won't find, I don't know, Althusser or Foucault, or, you know, none of that, as far as I know, is there. I've not come across any of it. So that's interesting, since I'm trying to use Marx and theory communiste and all the rest of it to talk about the class form of their architecture. They were not interested in a proletarian movement either. I don't think they had really any history of or relation to or even understanding of what we here might mean when we talk about the workers' movement, proletarian movement or something. They weren't interested in politics, even in social democratic politics. They were of their time where everybody was more or less a socialist in terms of social democracy. So there are periods when they say loosely that they're socialist, but everyone else is. That's usually how they put it. There are moments where they start to sound like neoliberals. They get very dissatisfied with the welfare state, and, you know, make comments that can sound quite neoliberal, and I think actually are in places very early on. So they don't fit any of the ideological spectrum from social democracy, socialism, to Marxism or the workers' movement that we would expect. And part of my argument is that that is actually almost irrelevant to understanding the politics and the class form that emerges in their architecture, because their architecture comes from all sorts of rather interesting spaces and, more importantly, develops in really interesting ways, if you like, regardless of their politics, and sometimes even counter to their politics, insofar as they have a politics. So there are a few points. I guess that's what I was trying to stress in the talk, but just to pick out one or two, this sense of the immanence of architecture to social relations, I think is entirely Marxist. The understanding that, or intuitively Marxist, if we put it like that, the understanding that architecture emerges not from the minds of the architect, the bourgeois model of creativity, but from problems that you abut against in the social world. I think that fits with Marx quite well. It's also incredibly Deleuzean. It's extraordinary how close Deleuze and Smithsons are on a number of these features. And there's no question that the Smithsons read Deleuze. They clearly didn't, albeit that he was publishing at the same time. So you said, where are they drawing their inspiration from? Well, I think it's a really interesting question. They were part of a group called Team 10, some of whom were politically active. One or two of them had a relationship to Asger Jorn in the Situations International. And there are clear ways why Jorn's interest in play and form and ornament are echoed, or maybe not even echoed, progressed by the Smithsons, but I don't think they were reading Jorn either. You know, it's quite extraordinary. What they were reading intellectually, aside from quite mundane early social democratic writers, were the Bergson features, Schoenberg, nonlinear dynamics, topology, all of these kinds of things, which were actually really important. Well, I've said this already, they were really important to the Situationists and to Jorn in particular, but also to Guy Debord. So I think the way they get closest to any of the kinds of ideas that we here might be more familiar with is via those topological, non-linear dynamics, those kinds of things. And when I was talking about the deforming forms of brutalism, or their brutalism, that's a reference to topology. And some of the one last thing, the critical work on play that was very prominent among the surrealists and what's his name, the writer of Homo Ludens and so on, that was in the air among the Team 10 group that they were working with. So I think the play was perhaps the form that was clearest, that was more clearly related to these kind of critical revolutionary traditions. And then one more thing, when they talk about class, even what they say about class isn't interesting, you know. So they produce a class architecture, but their ideas of class are banal, social democratic, and at one point downright reactionary. And that point is linked to Robin Hood Gardens, interestingly. But I'll stop there.
Great, thank you. I mean, so we've got quite a few questions in the chat. The people who have written the questions, you're more than welcome to ask them over Zoom as well, unless you'd like me to read them out. So maybe if you put your hand up, you can ask directly, otherwise I'll read them. So James asked, a quick question for Nick. What was the greatest impetus to the demolition and condemnation of Robin Hood Gardens, contrasting the survival of other brutalist landmarks such as the Trellick Tower, Brunswick Centre, Alexandra Estate, etc.?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, isn't it? The Balfron Tower, the kind of twin of Trellick Tower in Poplar in East London, is less than half a mile away from Robin Hood Gardens. For years, they were both stigmatized as violently as each other. In fact, I think the condemnation of Balfron might have even been greater than the condemnation of Robin Hood Gardens. And then all of a sudden, it happened quite quickly, Robin Hood, so they're both stigmatized, they're both concrete monstrosities. One of them heads towards demolition, the other gets transformed by what I was calling beautiful brutalism, by the culture industry, into a modernist gem, and is privatized. All the council tenants are kicked out, and then the building is done up in its kind of original features, all mid-century modern, marketed on the international market, and then privatized. And that's the process it's going through at the moment. So the question then is, what happened between these two estates? How is it one can head towards demolition and the other gets turned into a middle-class commune? I think there's a degree of chance involved in that. I think we have to, and Bev Skegg's work on this is really useful. I think we have to understand that we can have a discourse of beautiful brutalism or middle-class brutalism and the discourse of the Cinque Estate and the concrete monstrosity at the same time about the same kind of architecture. The point is, who is inhabiting that building? If it's the working class, it will remain a concrete monstrosity. If it can be the middle class, then it will become a beautiful brutalist gem. And so the two were going on at the same time. Those two carry on today. We will still have, almost in the same breath, people condemn Cinque Estates and concrete while saying, but I love Balfron Tower or Trellick, because that's now been transferred to middle class occupation. So why was it Robin Hood that got demolished and Balfron that didn't? I don't know. I often ask this. I think there's something very, very strange about Robin Hood Gardens as a piece of architecture, and I mean that in a good way. I think it was perhaps a little bit harder to convince the bourgeoisie that it was a good place to live, although I'm sure that would have been possible. It was in worse repair, although maybe, I mean, Balfron was in a pretty poor state of repair too. I think it might be simple. Oh, I'm going to give you the simple answer. There's an element of chance, but it was also on a very large piece of land relative to Balfron, and it's closer to Canary Wharf. And around it, there was a lot of derelict land. So in demolishing Robin Hood, they've been able to expand the footprint of the new site by, I think, 2, possibly 3 times. So perhaps it was just, you know, the use of land, the larger use of land that in the end is what drove it. But I think it could have gone the other way. It could have become, and some of the campaign for Robin Hood Gardens said exactly that. They would say, we know the residents hate it, but it could be occupied by students or architects, you know, or bankers, because Canary Wharf is over just down the road, which of course would not have been a solution to the problem.
Great. And we've got another question from Kim. I have a question for Jacopo, which is whether you could elaborate on whether the architecture you mentioned, especially the militant ones, have any relation or response to the autonomous refusal of work, which I think there's probably quite a lot to consider on that.
Yes, I think, I mean, the first example that comes to my mind is that of the feminist group, Group Imagine. One of the group members was an architect, practicing architect, Maria Grazia. She's still alive, almost 90, I think. I think she was one of the very few female architects in 1960s, 1970s, Italy. And she also made some houses, but the core idea was to kind of live, quit the household as a refusal of work. Of course, you know, the double burden of female labor. So some structures, we could probably say, if you want to use the categories I mentioned, engage with this sort of class architecture, in that they depict the departure, the women's departure from the household. So houses that, for example, force people, especially I remember a staircase that force people to go outside, I mean, visually at least, to go outside in order to go upstairs. And to, to give you a sense of, the kind of fascination of the outside. And then this is a very simple way to instantiate a sort of refusal of the place in society to which women were confined to. There are other examples, I think, and autonomy was, of course, a mass movement. So there were a lot of people studying architecture in Florence, for example. There was Potero Praio was very strong at the Department of Architecture in Florence. Prima Linea, an art group, was also quite well represented, but I didn't explore all of them. I think this is something very interesting if you look at the connections between autonomia, refusal of work, and architecture in the mid-70s.
Great. I don't know if Nick, you want to comment on the refusal of work side of things at all, but if not, I can ask the next question.
Just briefly, given any opportunity to talk about the refusal of work is a pleasure. I think so. I mean, with Robin Hood Gardens, that because there's no engagement with a workers' movement or a revolutionary subject or anything like that going on, what there is much more in the kind of Jameson sense of trying to reconfigure the human sensorium, and that's what he calls utopia. But in doing so, there is, the class architecture of Robin Hood Gardens does problematize work through play to some extent. I think they were trying to form a sensibility of play rather than the sensibility of the domestic or indeed of work. And they imagined, the Smithsons imagined, or their imagination was informed by the Keynesian idea at the time that work was rapidly going to diminish in significance. Now it's a flawed idea. As Marxists, we know that, but it was a common idea. So that this could be a site of play, and play was very important for them against work, or maybe in this free time between work. And at one point they talk about the Isle of Dogs becoming a leisure pleasure zone. It's very interesting for those of us that live in London. Of course, the Isle of Dogs is now the heart of one of the hearts of international finance, with all the banks and towers, but they imagined that disused docks could become a playground. It's a rather beautiful image.
Great. So we've got another question from J Bob, which is for Nick. So I think it's on your description of brutalism as found, and whether or not that excludes the economic structures and backgrounds of the architectural practice. And so J Bob asks, I guess the fact that Robin Hood Gardens was a council estate was very much making the life lived there possible, as in comparison to council estates which were privatized. And then in this kind of second part of the question, was there any part of the gardens which were privatized through right to buy, as the Trellick Tower was partly privatized through that scheme? So a comparison there might be interesting.
Yeah. So the as found is this Smithson's term. They take it from Nigel Henderson, and it's a bit like a development of the surrealist objet trouvé, or found object. And the idea is that one loses oneself, immerses oneself in materials, in objects, in that which you encounter by chance, and that they have an almost mystical or magical quality that will kind of transform your sensorium, your sense of the world, and so forth. That's the primary basis for the term. But they then, when they sort of take it from Nigel Henderson, they then start to use the as found as a way of doing research on a site. So instead of cleansing a site, you know, like a kind of tabula rasa, which is the modernist approach, and rebuilding on it, you would immerse yourself in the site and try and reconfigure your plans, your ideas, your architecture through that immersion with the site as found. And what I argue in my book, although you're Bob, you're absolutely right, it's not explicit in their figure. What I argue in my book is that they also approach society as found. They don't call it as found, but all of those comments about confronting society, responding to the crises and the conflicts of society, allowing an architecture that emerges from problems as found, is no different. And so it's a way of helping to describe, or it's no different in its mode of engagement, a self-loss, an immersion, an encounter with the social as much as with the material world. And that way you can then start insisting more clearly that the Smithson's brutalism is simultaneously aesthetic and ethical, or aesthetic and social. That's why I use the term this self-decentering relationship to materials and to social relations and social forces. Yeah, in terms of its, yeah, and being, and that's the point, isn't it? I mean, you know, what the Smithsons are confronting and working with is the possibility of mass housing. The welfare state was appalling in so many ways. It had so many limits. And council housing was appalling in so many ways. We love to celebrate it because it's even worse today. But the problem of manufacturing, producing enough housing for people to live in, which was sort of running through society during this period, certainly as compared to today, is a hugely important one. And their response was to that. What is mass housing? What is working class housing? As a provision, in their case, of a pocket of protection, a means of living in the city for the working class. So yeah, I agree. It's absolutely fundamentally important, and it's, you know, it's completely disgusting and disgraceful that we're demolishing them. In terms of the right to buy, I don't have the figures in front of me, but a relatively small proportion of Robin Hood residents bought their estate. I could say 30 apartments. I think it's something like that. So, I mean, it's not nothing, but it's relatively small compared to 213 homes on the estate. But at Balfron, I think it was similar. I don't think so many people had bought at Balfron Tower either, whereas you're right, at Trellick in West London, that was the main way it became gentrified, was through private sales. To gentrify Balfron, they had to kick all the council tenants out and then spend a great deal of money refurbishing it.
Cheers. And so we've got a kind of follow-up question from Steve to both Jacopo and Nick regarding so let me read it. Apart from supporting housing struggles in the 1970s, did different operaista stances that Jacopo discussed examine the working class use of architecture in struggle and otherwise? So I assume the active appropriation of architecture within the struggles they were conducting. If you got any comments on that.
Well, yes, I think one of the small discoveries of my book is that some militants, and namely Magnaghi, and to a certain extent, but Deganello as well, try to kind of use architecture and to think of issues that were largely neglected by class operaia in the mid-60s. So, for example, the issue of care, childcare, or the issue of horticulture. So a sort of autonomy that is also that of having like, selling your own produces on a local base. So in a way, there's this kind of discourse on, maybe we could say, the commons, because the distinction was then still between a sort of public and private. Whereas they try to kind of configure, in my view, a sort of, common. So the land, access to light, and so on through architecture and urban planning. Another thing, and I think this is something that might links up with Nick's ideas, is that by reframing the dichotomy between city and countryside, you actually reframe the idea of class. And this was absolutely crucial for operaism, which was trying to go beyond the very standard and classic distinction between farmers, peasants, and workers, industrial workers. So urban concepts like city territory, factory city, and so on and so forth, also try to use architecture and urban planning to kind of move beyond a very traditional idea of the industrial working class. So they also say, and this is something that also exists in Marx, I mean, the farmers are no longer, this, very isolated political subject. They are they're integrated within the peripheries of large cities. So they're no longer, the people we tend to imagine as isolated. They are part of the working class. And so urban planning and architecture also contribute to that.
I don't know if Nick, you have any follow-up you'd like to comment on that, or?
I think it is I think it is an interesting question that seems to come, certainly in England with this, its sort of own obsession with landscape, although perhaps that's the same in architecture. It's so permeated with questions of class and class problems that it does seem to bubble up among architectural discussion. What is the relationship between the urban working class and the countryside? Can that be overcome? And I think it came to the Smithsons not through Marx, because clearly it's an important question for Marx, but through their experience of the north of England and the industrial slag heaps and coal mines and stuff. They had a very kind of industrial working class background. So their way of bringing the nature into the city was in part to create that zone I was talking about, that rather beautiful zone of protection, the urban nature between the two buildings, but it was also to come and plonk a mound in the middle of that zone that for them partially echoed the coal slag heaps of the industrial north, which is quite intriguing, really. If you want to bring nature into the city, you would not normally bring a slag heap to do that, or echo a slag heap. But what they were trying to do, I think, was to produce an experience of nature, an image of nature, a real nature that was threaded through with industry, like a form of nature that wasn't mystifying, a kind of post-industrial nature. And there's a great book by somebody called Gisson who talks about the mound in Robin Hood in these ways, and he calls it sub-nature. And he uses this idea of sub-nature to present the mound at Robin Hood Gardens and other examples against the tendency in the development industry to green everything with photovoltaic panels and and all of this, which is always used to gentrify. It's never really about greening anything. Whereas what the Smithsons are doing, say, no, our nature is threaded with industry, and let's face up to that somehow. Let's live with that somehow. Which I think is so that's partly why I call it a working class landscape. At once natural, at once inhabited by wildlife and birds, at once providing a bit of air and green and trees, and at the same time being threaded through with industrial forces, the rubble of the homes that existed beforehand.
Great, thank you. we've got time, I'm sure, if people are available for maybe a question more or two, and if not, I have another one, and then perhaps I'll end the recording and we can just have a slightly more free-form and open discussion. People unmute themselves, but if there's any other questions, please put them in the chat. And I was going to, if I can quickly ask one, is ask, obviously, autonomy and workerism talk about the idea of working class autonomy or workers' autonomy in different registers. And I just, on that brutalism has found gallery, Nick, that on one of the pages, there's the scene of lots of the residents kind of repainting and reconstructing parts of the the built environment. I was wondering if either of you could make a comment on what sense we can think of workers' autonomy or the autonomy of the working class within architecture on that kind of level of repurposing the lived environment. It's not as you've spoken in great detail on the kind of lived experience of brutalism, but also what that might mean a kind of on a political level of autonomy as well from the kind of design that the architects have imposed. If you could, I don't know if that makes sense, but I'd be interested in hearing slightly more on that.
Yeah, I think it's an important question. It's an important question for the Smithsons too. They say, Alison Smithson says modernism, although she's referring more to her kinds of modernism, I think. She says it should be understood as releasant. We think of it as imposing and dominating. Even those who enjoy it often think about it as imposing and dominating. And she say, no, it should be releasant. It should encourage use, transformation. And now clearly it's a question about whether they did achieve that, or whether modernism does or doesn't achieve that, but that was certainly what they wanted. And so at Robin Hood, they talk about it was designed in a way that was encouraging what she called signs of occupancy, where residents would make the space their own. So there were these eddy spaces. There was one photo I showed of where the homes open up at right angles to the street deck. So they bring a bit of the home out into the street and a bit of the street and the outside into the home. So it's a kind of threshold, eddy space. And they hoped that people would put pot plants there, and that people, as they did, would put chairs there, and they would use their bicycles around there. They would hang out in these zones. So that was what the signs of occupancy they hoped for would come, and they did to some extent. But, what's nice is that the residents, not consciously, not following her guidance, obviously, but took it upon themselves to start painting the concrete, which of course for aficionados of brutalism would be sacrilege, but I like to think that for the Smithsons, although no doubt they'd be shocked, they in the end would rather like that the architecture encouraged that. And there's an image, the one you're talking about, where if you look at a certain angle, you see 7 or 8 homes, all of whom have had bright colors or gradations of bright colors painted outside the homes, running all the way down the street deck, and it looked beautiful. One of them with these purple dots. One of them covered the whole of the outside in purple, really strong, vibrant purple, and it put a sort of post box, a rather sort of ornate post box by their front door. And although in the end, I took this out of the book because I didn't speak to them formally, but my impression was they didn't like the estate at all, and this was a way of trying to hide it. So that the use and the colouring and the transformation was a kind of autonomy, even to the extent of those who were there who didn't like living there would try and hide their estate through colour. But yeah, it was used. People put it to use. They used I think it is an autonomy, a workers' autonomy, partly facilitated by the disinvestment by the council. So I think there's a certain point where people just started feeling they were just going to do it all themselves, which of course the disinvestment is appalling and terrible, but it did have these little moments that became, creative.
I wanted to say something about self-building, because this is something that I discuss in the book. There's especially one example, the Ganello, as I said, one of an architect, but also a member of Architecture and a member of the Prior for a relatively short period of time, but also very close to Autonomia. At some point, exhibited at the Triennale of Milan, so quite a prominent showcase for design and architecture. Actually, 3 pieces of interior design. One of them which also included a video, was referencing the house, the self-built house of a worker who was also a member of Classe Operaia, who actually, so it's a sort of documentary about the house built in the wood illegally with illegal material that was largely stolen from various building sites. And his wife actually tells the story of the house. And this work is related to Tafuri, where basically Tafuri has the role of the kind of authoritative historian of architecture, telling the story of houses from an institutional perspective. So there's this nice juxtaposition between an academic discourse, albeit Marxist, and self-building of a worker. And this is the third piece, which is about hippies and tents as a form of architecture, but this is something we won't discuss.
Great. Maybe just one final one, which we've got posted in the chat, and then I'll stop the recording and we can kind of just chat if people want to. Following from that, from Philip. What about not just the appropriation of ready-made building that resulted from a division of labor going back to at least the Renaissance in Europe, but the self-building of people, working class or otherwise, or the direct involvement of architects in this process, such as Segal? Yeah, so if maybe we could close with some comments on that, which I think follow up from our last point.
Yeah, no, I think it's a vital question. I'm certainly not at all trying to say that that class architecture should be made of concrete at an industrial scale, only designed by architects and so forth. Absolutely not. I think self-build, complex modes of building where architectural knowledge and design is sort of intuitive or drawn into a social group that are building, all of that I hope is our future, you know. I absolutely do. But the particular focus of my talk, although clearly you're raising something else, was to think about how you engage with the existent, with the buildings that are with us now, with council housing now, with, you know, brutalism now, with Robin Hood Gardens now, and also clearly even after a revolution, we shouldn't be demolishing these buildings because they have an appalling all the embodied carbon that's in the buildings has to be held there. You know, concrete is an appalling polluter, appalling producer of carbon emissions. So we don't need more concrete, and we shouldn't be demolishing the concrete that we have. So I think I like what you're saying there. I think that should be happening now, or is happening now, should happen more, and absolutely very much should be our future. Let's hope so.
Great. A nice note to end on in terms of thinking of architecture after the revolution and reclaiming the present. Great. So I'll stop the recording here. Thanks very much to both Nick and Jacopo for speaking with us, and for everyone who's asked questions as well.